International Trade Group and the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, which is a relatively new institution, which has a very interesting mission, which Sabine will explain to you. It's a very good people attached to it. Sabine is an economist. She received her PhD from the University of Maastricht in sustainable development in the energy sector. Previously, she worked at EASA's Ecosystem Services and Management Program on development of economic methods with an emphasis on uncertainty and risk. At Mercator, she's responsible for international and national projects in the area of climate change mitigation and adaptation, with a special focus on land use and various other functions. She's going to talk to us today about negative emissions in a multi-objective world, harnessing carbon dioxide removal potential under sustainability concerns, and this has become a very contentious area, so I'm sure you'll get us not just into the technical details, but the politics of it too.
Hopefully, and also into a nice discussion. So thank you very much for this nice introduction, and as you said, I want to first start off explaining a little bit more about where I come from. So, though some of you might still know me from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, where I, as was already said, worked at the Ecosystem Services and Management Program. I've now been for more than 2 years already at the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, which is located in Berlin. Actually, you can see the campus down here, and this is our building right next to the gasometer. This picture has actually changed a little bit because there's a lot of building activity been going on in the last 2 years. But if any of you should make their way to Berlin in the near future, please let me know, and I'll give you the tour, of course. So the MCC is a scientific think tank, and we've grown to be about more than 40 people now. So we're a relatively small institute, but it's also meant to be like that because we're supposed to fill a little bit the niche between the larger institutes working on large-scale modeling, and we assess strategies for sustainable management of natural commons, but also the social commons, so the provision of public goods and so on. And what we're trying to do more specifically is that we try to identify trade-offs, but also opportunities for synergies between different policy objectives. For instance, in the context of climate change and sustainable development, a project that I've been involved in is about abolishing fossil fuel subsidies or pricing carbon, and then using the proceeds from that in order to finance other sustainable development goals, such as providing access to basic infrastructures, to water, sanitation, electricity, and so on. So we're trying to also find opportunities while also looking at trade-offs. And last but not least, we also try to inform the public debate, and we have a working group that's specifically working on how we can improve the science policy interface, how are assessments being made and used by the policy community, and how could we actually improve on that. Now, this also gets reflected in our organizational structure, so we have these 7 topical working groups down here, where I lead the one on sustainable resource management and global change, but where we present everything from economic growth, infrastructure and transport, over to sustainability science, climate and development, as I just mentioned as an example, and also governance. And this one here, working group 5, is the working group working on the science policy interface. Probably many of you will know our director, Professor Dr. Edenhofer, being advised by an expert advisory board, and also our institute is embedded within the wider landscape of universities and schools in Berlin and also the Brandenburg area. So we also have an institutional board, and the MCC has been jointly founded by the Mercator Foundation, as our name also says, and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. Now, what I'm going to show you today is not only an outgrowth of my last 2 years at the MCC, but also a collaborative effort with colleagues from the Global Carbon Project that I joined last year. Well, the Global Carbon Project was developed to look at comprehensive and policy-relevant research, understanding the global carbon cycle, not only looking at the natural processes, but also at the interaction with the human dimension. And it has three basic core activities. First is probably the most famous one, which is on the diagnostics, bringing out every year the Global Carbon Project, the Global Carbon Budget, but also other flagship projects such as the methane budget, the carbon atlas, and so on. We're also looking at processes and feedbacks to assess vulnerability, and my activity is mostly located in the low carbon dimension, where we look at carbon management and policy, and where I lead an initiative on negative emissions that I'm going to speak about in a minute. So the Global Carbon Project is one of the core projects of Future Earth, and therefore also has a lot of access to other communities, and is a nice platform for actually inviting also more research and more interdisciplinary research to look at negative emissions. So, delving into the topic now, what are we actually talking about when we're talking about negative emissions? And actually, some people prefer that to be called carbon dioxide removal, and that is exactly what it does. It removes carbon from the atmosphere. And if we look at the latest scenarios of the IPCC community from the fifth assessment report, let me start with those scenarios centering around the representative concentration path 2.6, which is associated with a relatively high probability of still reaching the 2-degree target. And what we actually see is that by the end of the century, the majority of those pathways actually cross the zero line, and we end up with negative emissions. So we actually stop emitting and adding carbon to the emissions in the atmosphere, and we take carbon actually out. Having said that, let's have a look also at the other scenarios. And even those that are less ambitious are actually associated with negative emissions, though you might not see it here. Well, a couple of the yellow ones do actually cross the line, but even those that do not cross the zero line do have negative emissions embedded. That means we remove carbon, we just don't remove sufficient carbon in order to offset the remaining residual positive emissions. That means without negative emissions, those pathways would also be higher. And even a couple of those that are close to a business as usual pathway for emissions do exhibit offsetting. This offsetting of the remaining positive residual emissions happens then in other sectors or also in other regions of the world, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So what is actually behind this crossing the zero line, or also the negative emissions that don't need to net negative emissions? Well, most of the pathways do rely on a technology relying on carbon neutral bioenergy. Carbon neutral because the biomass that is planted as a feedstock for the bioenergy production sequesters as much carbon as is then produced when we combust it for energy generation. So more or less, this should come out to be about carbon neutral, and I'll get back to that because I'm sure a lot of you have concerns about this, and I'll dive a little bit more into that later on. Well, if on top of that we then also capture the carbon instead of releasing it to the atmosphere and sticking it to geological formations, we should end up with negative emissions. So a lot of you might actually say, okay, but why don't we just do this part and enhance our terrestrial carbon sinks by planting more trees or other types of biomass and sequester the CO2 in those carbon sinks? Well, we can do that, and that's also actually part of some of the AR5 scenarios, but it will raise some similar concerns to the ones attached to large-scale deployment of BACs, as I will show in a minute. Also, lately, a lot of concerns post-AR5, that is this picture, expressing concerns about the impact on albedo, because if you increase the forest area, then you have less reflection from the surface of the Earth back into space, and then you might actually have offsetting effects of the previously beneficial carbon effect that might have decreased the temperature. Also, I brought you a map from a publication at PIC, which shows the distribution of the mitigation potential of deforestation. So what you see here are the tons of carbon per hectare per year. And what you see is that mostly this is distributed in the tropical basins, and to a lesser extent also in the boreal area, which then of course also raises issues with respect to governance and implementation of this deployment and the global regulatory framework that we would need for that, very much in the same style as we're having a discussion now about the framework for reducing emissions from avoided deforestation and degradation. So, but back to BECS, because I told you this is the one really prominent in the AR5 scenarios, and what you see here is the net CO2 emissions plotted against the BECS share in total primary energy at the end of the century. And the dots, the color of the dots, correspond again to the concentrations that I've used also in the previous graph a couple of slides ago. So you see here also that most of the green and blue dots are actually under the zero line, but what you also see, and I've already indicated it a little bit before, is that a lot of the yellow ones, the brown ones, and maybe even some of the red ones do actually also use quite a bit of BECS. So that means BECS has a really dominant role here, and in order not to make you count those dots here, we've already done that for you. So actually there are 116 blue dots, and 101 of them actually do rely on BECS. And out of those, more than 2/3 have a BECS share that exceeds 20% of total primary energy. I mean, if you think of current penetration rates of renewables, then this is really a high number. And a lot of people have voiced concerns about whether that is really possible under a lot of sustainability concerns. So in this work that we've done with colleagues from the Global Carbon Project, we've looked at the different scenarios in more detail and tried to extract what are the main uncertainties associated with these potentials that are used there. And this is, of course, also something that has been partially done by the IPCC in the AFULU chapter, and especially in the bioenergy appendix. So the first block of uncertainties that we're concerned with are related to technology and our ability to have sustainable potentials of biomass. And in the IPCC report, this is suggested to be between 100 and 300 exajoule of equivalent primary energy in the middle of the century. However, especially the higher numbers are highly contested, even among the scientists, and there is also quite a discussion as to the idea of having the additional biomass on abandoned land, because it's not really clear whether that land is really abandoned and in how far it would be productive enough to generate the same amount of biomass. The other big technological uncertainty is related to carbon capture and storage. We also have some expertise actually in the room today. Mostly about the storage availability, even though geologists I'm talking to are very optimistic usually that there is sufficient storage capacity, there is of course a risk and maybe also a cost related to potential leakage. And there we should also take into account that most of the leakage that is usually worried about in the public debate is about the leakage that goes to the surface and up into the atmosphere, thereby reversing what we previously did in order to extract the CO2. But there's also a risk of subsurface leakage that might actually be higher and where that could be associated with quite some cost if it, for instance, contaminates groundwater and so on. So these are all things that need to still be taken into account in near-coming scenarios. Other resource needs, of course, are also of concern. Water will be needed, fertilizer, and I will come back to that. Then, and here come my natural science colleagues from the Global Carbon Project in carbon cycle dynamics are also by far not certain, especially the dynamics under a concentration overshoot. Will we cross thresholds that lead to irreversible changes, such as a major methane outgassing after a permafrost thawing, something at that dimension? And also it is not clear if we can resolve the uncertainty about the dynamics under the overshoot. What will actually happen if we remove the carbon? How will oceans and also the terrestrial ecosystems react to that? The other dimension is concerned with policy and mitigation mix, because everything that we decide today will affect what kind of options we have open in the future. So it's important to also keep in mind the dynamics of costs, risks, and also the timing and what options we can afford to discard and which not. And finally, we also need to worry about institutions and governance. Very much in the same way as the afforestation mitigation potential is not distributed homogeneously across the globe, the same can be said for the biomass potential. So how will that look like in a global regulatory framework? And related to that, of course, how will the monitoring, the reporting, the verification be handled? And even if we can solve those more global concerns, we also will have problems at a local level, especially if we broaden our view again from biomass to also CCS. There's been, at least where I come from in Europe, a lot of opposition by the public against storage. In principle, they think CCS is okay, but not if it's done somewhere close to where they live. So this is also something that needs to be taken into account. So in the face of all these uncertainties, there's been a lot of press about this before the COP and also during the COP. Should we actually just give up on BECCS and leave it? Well, the thing is that with even more ambitious climate targets having been discussed in Paris, I think it's an option that we might not easily be able to easily discard. And what I mean with that, you can see in the following figure that's based on the technical summary of the IPCC's working with C-PREE AR5 report. And basically you see these negative emissions in the energy sector over here in 2100. And they're, of course, they're massive, even the median. But what that actually enables us to do is to be a bit more flexible in other sectors while we decarbonize the system. And this is true for transport, but this is even more true for the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. And these are the emissions that are closely associated with our food system. So this will be quite a painful trade-off. Usually what we hear is, okay, BECCS is jeopardizing our ability to feed a growing population in the future. But if we have to do all the mitigation otherwise, then actually there will have to be some painful choices involved here as well. So there's always two sides of a story, and I think we should not forget that, and that there is some value in preserving our options for the future. So, what you could also say then, and actually some people have said that, is, well, maybe we should then give up on the 2-degree scenario. Actually, I've read a few things that even said, well, scientists have been lying to us. It's not even possible anymore to reach 2 degrees, and I should just be open about it so that we can get on and get prepared for worse temperatures. So I think in the light of the Paris Agreement, discarding 2 degrees is at least something that a lot of people would agree we should not do. But also, it doesn't take us out of the responsibility to think about the problem, because then we will have to deal with the impacts. And I borrowed here a couple of pictures from a recent letter in Nature by Berg et al. That I liked very, very much. And what they did was they reconciled micro evidence and macro level evidence on the impact of temperature increases on economic productivity. And what they found out was that it's actually not really the case that wealthier nations will be sheltered from climate impacts because they may have higher adaptive capacity and so on. Actually, if you reach a certain temperature, any country will be affected. And that temperature is somewhere around 13 degrees Celsius. And that's actually what you see here. You have that peak, and after that, actually also the developed world will see economic losses due to climate change. And that means that our damage functions should be adapted. And if you do that, you see that the global economic losses due to climate change could exceed previous estimates by quite a bit. Still, the burden will disproportionately fall on the southern countries in the beginning, just because the average temperature is already higher. And the question is then, what do we do if we abandon the 2-degree scenario? Will we compensate those countries? Well, I think that will be quite difficult, and we already took quite a while to get to a climate agreement. And in the end, if we discarded the 2-degree scenario, the 2-degree target, and BECS for reasons of high uncertainty, we should not forget that impacts and research on impacts is also surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. So I see that already coming out as an excuse for not coming up with a proper scheme for compensation too. So one way or the other, I would conclude for now, before going on with some more research, that yes, many uncertainties remain about facts, but we won't get out of the responsibility of looking into the climate change problem, especially if now we're trying to strive for something even below 2 degrees Celsius. So the question that we asked ourselves is, can we then resolve or reduce some of these uncertainties that have been mentioned before, and have a closer look at what is a more realistic potential of BECS, or what does it actually imply for all these concerns of sustainability that we have? And are there other alternatives? And that is something that we have done in a paper that came out during the COP just a week ago. And basically what we're trying to do is to take a more comprehensive view on this, and acknowledge that the negative emissions potential could be expanded by technological progress, breakthroughs in crop yields, for instance, removal of policy barriers, and so on. But there's also a lot of factors that could constrain it. So, and I've already mentioned economic, societal, and climate limits before, but what we want to do in this paper is to take a first step at getting more clarity on the resource limitations and on the biophysical constraints that we're facing. So, just as this will be a little bit repetitive, but I think it's actually quite good to introduce the other negative emission technologies that we looked at. So if you look at the combustion of fossil fuel emissions, then we actually take them out of geological reservoirs, combust them, and add to the atmosphere. With bioenergy, as I explained before, this is different because we first take up a certain amount of CO2 by growing additional biomass, and then release it again by combusting it. So this should come out about carbon neutral if it's done sustainably. Then if on top of that you actually don't do this, you don't release it into the atmosphere, but you stick it underground, you're actually reducing cumulative emissions, which does not work if you do CCS on fossils, because then you just put back what you took out. And then what we're also looking on in this paper is direct air capture, where you actually, through chemical reactions, directly absorb CO2 and store it underground. So this decreases cumulative emissions. Enhanced weathering, which is a process where you grind certain minerals, such as olivine, and distribute it over agricultural areas to also absorb CO2. Actually also is a form of directly causing negative emissions. And finally, what I've also touched upon briefly before, you can enhance sinks. You can enhance both land sinks through afforestation and ocean sinks, for instance, through fertilization. But in this article, we focus on the terrestrial sinks because we screened the literature on ocean fertilization, and we found that there were quite a bit of uncertainties that kept us from coming up with a comprehensive assessment here. But that's also something where a lot of work is going on. So how did we approach this? First, we looked at the AR5 scenarios and also added those of other prominent model intercomparison exercises. And we then looked at those scenarios that were associated with a high probability of achieving 2 degrees C. And those were found to extract 3.3 gigaton C per year on average. And then we asked ourselves, what does this removal of 3.3 gigaton C by BACs imply for land, water, nutrients, energy, albedo, and costs? And where we could, we actually extracted that information from the scenarios. And where we couldn't, and that was most of the time the case, we actually went back to more basic data and the literature in order to construct those numbers. And then we also looked at enhanced weathering, afforestation, and direct air capture, as I explained before, and asked ourselves, how far can we actually go? Can we reach those 3.3 gigaton C with those as well? And what would that then imply for these 6 different dimensions I mentioned before? And if we can't, we actually take the maximum potential where we could get to. And these are the results of this, but I actually also brought the paper with me, so you can have a closer look afterwards if you like. I'll just give you the highlights now. So we start with land up here, and clearly direct air capture seems to have by far the smallest land requirement. But that is only insofar as we don't, for instance, decide to use solar energy, for instance, and have large amounts of land covered by solar panels. So that also has to be taken with a bit of caution. Then enhanced weathering has a little bit more, which is hardly visible here. And I should also say that, in fact, it is not directly in competition with those areas of land that you would use for food production, because if you spread it on the agricultural areas, you can still grow things there, you can still grow crops, and you might actually have a positive benefit because the grinded minerals do increase the pH value of the soil. Then for BACs and afforestation, we definitely have the highest land requirement. BACs from crops, that would be willow and poplar, from short rotation coppice and miscanthus. That would actually be 7 to 25% of the current agricultural land, so that's quite a bit. For afforestation, even though it is absolutely more and doesn't directly compete for the agricultural land, it would be 6 to 20% of total agricultural land. And if you take that together, that's actually 2 to 4 times the amount of the land that is currently labeled as being abandoned. And as I told you before, it's even contested whether that is all so abandoned and how productive it is and so on. So definitely it's evident that there are concerns about adverse effects to other ecosystem services. Now, for energy, let's jump first to energy. Direct air capture is actually quite energy intensive and also costly, and so it's enhanced weathering because this process of grinding the minerals requires a lot of energy. For the water requirement, direct air capture would use about 4% of total evapotranspiration for the current crops, and enhanced weathering a lot less. BECCS, on the other hand, would use quite a bit, up to 10%, and similarly for afforestation. And if we look at nutrients and albedo, we see that forest feedstocks require less nitrogen than purpose-grown crops, but it also has a higher risk of changing the albedo and having these offsetting effects that I mentioned before. So I should also say that, of course, the models that have been used to generate the scenarios are cost optimizing models, and then it is actually not so surprising that they also take up a lot of BECCS, because BECCS actually doesn't need energy, but it produces energy. So there's also a huge co-benefit in terms of what the models are looking for. So this is also summarized again in this table, which I'm also showing you again because I want to show you that direct air capture actually could get up to those 3.3 gigatons C per year at the end of the century, but enhanced weathering actually could not, because it's constrained by the amount of agricultural land that it could be spread out on, and also by the amount of minerals that we could extract at a certain cost. Afforestation could actually be hiked up to 3.3, but it would actually imply an even higher requirement of land than BECCS. So there is also in the paper a very confusing illustration of a summary of all these impacts, but we believe it will become iconic at some point. So let me briefly explain to you how this works. So we have the negative emissions on the y-axis and the energy on the x-axis. So what I just said, that consumes a lot of energy, means that it's to the very right on this graph, and BECCS actually producing energy being on the negative energy requirement side of the graph. The size of the bubble is actually about the cost, DOC being the highest, then coming at enhanced weathering and BECCS, and then afforestation being much lower. The colors are actually for the land requirement. The redder it gets, the more we should be alerted about consuming a lot of land. And the water drops are, I think they are quite straightforward. They actually show the water requirement of those different options. So maybe after explaining it, it's helpful overall. So to conclude on this, what we found is that basically all those negative emission technologies run into their own respective limits. So we think what we'll be most likely focusing on in future work is looking at a portfolio of options that try to minimize potentially adverse effects. And actually, I had the honor of contributing a paper to the special issue by Rob Sokola, Massimo Taroni, and Climate and Change already before the IPCC report in 2013, where we looked already a little bit of the dynamics of a portfolio. This was a very stylized model and of course didn't take a lot of this into account, but I think we need to take into account also how we change our portfolio over time, and how we can keep our options open. And what already came forth from this work, and what is also actually supported by the AR5 scenarios, is that negative emissions are actually not an excuse to continue business as usual emissions now. Because we wouldn't even be able to get down from such high concentrations in the second half of the century. All those pathways do have a lot of standard abatement already in the short to medium run, and negative emissions are part of the whole climate change mitigation portfolio. So I think this is also an important point that is a little bit overlooked in the debate, where negative emissions get often put into one bucket with other geoengineering options. This is actually, I think, not the right way to look at it, because we would have to deal with a lot of additional problems of rising cumulative emissions until we extract the CO2, if we would view it like that. And I'm not only talking about the thresholds that we could surpass and that we don't even know about maybe, and that could make it even more difficult to get down, but I'm also talking about biophysical effects such as ocean acidification. Still, even after this article, there is a lot of concern about the social and economic sustainability dimensions. We haven't really touched on those in the article that I just presented. We've looked more at the biophysical limits and the sustainability goals that are associated with that. However, in the future, we want to have a more broader look, as the community is now looking at the sustainable development goals and how they could be implemented. And climate change mitigation is only one of them. So we have to take a bit broader view, and what we also want to do is to moving away from this view of constraints and limits, but also to look for opportunities and look at the whole option space. And if one thing doesn't work out, or we have a lot of uncertainty about that, how can we preserve flexibility? How can we come up with robust pathways that also shelter us a little bit from the risks that we might not know enough about? So a glimpse at some first modeling results in this direction. This is some work that is going on at my old colleague's place at IASA, with a global bottom-up partial equilibrium model that integrates the agricultural, forest, and bioenergy sectors. And some first results show that actually there could be some potentially negative effects on irrigation, water use, and biodiversity if we have large-scale BECCS deployment. So this mostly comes through land use change. If you don't have forest protection regulation that keeps biomass cultivation expansion from extending into the forest. And on the other hand, though, negative emissions could also be a potential source of income, and especially so in the current scenarios. This is the case in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa, and this comes from carbon payments for afforestation, but also revenue from biomass production. And in the preliminary scenarios, it does not look like there would be a substantial negative effect on agriculture and forest markets, so also not to a large degree distorting food prices. So at the Global Carbon Project and also at the FCC, we're trying to provide a little bit of a platform also for different communities to come together to look at these problems. And I think one way or the other, we will need to make this bridge between the disciplines, because the uncertainties are so multi-layered that we will need a common effort to reduce those. And I would invite any of you that have ideas for instance, for collaboration on this, or also for us to take other things into account, to just come forth with that in a discussion. And thank you for your attention, and back to Michael.
let me open it up by asking a question. Could you explain what limits enhanced weather and why there's a relatively low potential?
Yes. So enhanced weathering is basically when we grind this olivine mineral and then spread it over agricultural area. It's actually a very nice idea because it doesn't take away the land for food production. It could even act as a positive benefit in terms of increasing pH value, as we just said before. On the other hand, these minerals that you can use for that are also limited to a certain extent. And even though there is some uncertainty about it, at which cost it would still be possible to extract a little bit more of that, it would never reach those potentials that we see realized by DEX. And then, of course, also it's limited by the amount of land that you can spread it on, like agricultural land and so on. So we've already gone up to the maximum of what is currently assumed, or actually not assumed, but found out to be possible in the literature. But I'm actually not an enhanced weathering expert.
Maybe you should develop the expertise,
yes.
Make it more promising. Questions?
So when I think about afforestation, I think of it as sort of a one-time thing because you saturate eventually the carbon absorption, whereas I think of BECCS as more of an ongoing thing, assuming that you've got the storage space. Am I thinking about that improperly? They just sort of seem like a little bit apples and oranges as mitigation techniques. One that goes on continuously and the other one that you can only get fixes.
So actually, that's actually a little bit what I wanted to show also in the beginning. So basically, if we enhance the terrestrial, sink to afforestation, we're basically stopping here. We're adding trees or other plants that then sequester CO2, and that basically stays there. Then you have to add new trees in order to do it, whereas with BECCS, of course, you harvest them, and then you plant new ones again that take up new CO2. That's the right way of thinking about it.
So the idea of CCS has been kicked around for maybe 20 or 30 years now, and there hasn't been a lot of progress in terms of real project. And I'm wondering how, if you think about the rate at which you can actually begin to introduce these sort of technologies, and is that taken into account? Or how is that taken into account in these scenarios?
Yes. So in the scenarios, in the IPCC scenarios, in the fifth assessment report, basically the diffusion of the CCS technology is guided by a CO2 price, either imposed or as a shadow price, because you constrain the quantity of emissions that you are allowed to emit. And actually we see CCS diffusion only at relatively high CO2 prices. In the real world, which is what you are referring to, it is not what we're currently seeing. And so we are actually very much behind on demonstration and on actually getting the technology deployed. And actually the International Energy Agency updated their CCS roadmap last year or even the year before. And they were very much worried that what we see in terms of current deployment and what we would have to be in terms of the scenarios, there's already quite a big gap. And the feeling is that we're actually quite late on trying to close that gap and getting where we have to be if that is really the solution. So that is definitely a valid concern. And then if on top of that also bioenergy would need CCS, then of course we have even more stuff to store.
So, first, there's no consideration of demand changes. This is a supply control strategy approach, strategic approach. That is, you start with, start with the UN goals, which in my opinion, are currently in conflict and rest on the idea of massive technology solutions without looking at operate as social animals. So I don't want to go into a long diatribe because it would take a long time, but I'll make only one comment. Having been intimately involved in CCS for 15 years, I think it's a non-starter. I would further go to suggest that biofuels are another vehicle for enhancing a carbon-based economy, and the assumption that you're going to have a net zero or a net negative, despite the very elegant presentation, is not something that I'm at all convinced of. Finally, I'm not sure why one should be going down this path at all. In other words, if you're going to go to a green economy, which is a current demand, there is some storage, but largely a current demand economy, the only time we've had decreases in CO2 are associated with economic downturns, which have been very effective. And they've also been effective in decreasing population and ultimately demand, because in an integrated system which is looking at food and water and ecosystem damage.
Could you speed it up? Just ask a question.
So, anyway, thank you.
Yes. Well, I mean, what I can say to that is that a lot of the people in the integrated assessment community are now moving, or have already moved, into the direction of taking also demand-side measures into account. So there is already some peer-reviewed literature on, for instance, decreasing meat consumption, changes in living styles, energy efficiency, and so on. So it is going into that direction, recognizing this, but I believe if we're already at 400 ppm and lifestyles are typically something that is not easily changed overnight, I mean, I have a hard time believing that tomorrow we stop flying and eating out, and it also involves some distributional concerns, whether we can actually deny the type of growth that we had to countries that are still emerging. Then I think it would be probably premature to give up trying to look into technological solutions in the first place.
And maybe a procedural question. So you put this up as a result of IPCC scenarios, and in these scenarios, the scenarios tell you that BECCS is an interesting option in that context. So you put this out as that's already the solution, and now it seems like you're now presenting only after the fact the analysis of what it would actually mean. And it turns out there are lots of caveats and questions about not only feasibility but also about even the cost effectiveness, maybe about social impact, biophysical impact, and so on and so forth. And now it looks like you're sort of taking a step back, and maybe that wasn't really the result that we should have presented in the IPCC, not you personally, but the community should have presented to the world as that is a feasible or desirable option. So I'm wondering, what do you think about generating a general uneasiness about the process of coming up with options as feasible, and then later essentially retracting, saying maybe that wasn't really what we wanted to say?
Yes, so that is a very good question, because this is actually what's happening. A lot of people saying, I said it before, a lot of people saying like, hey, you scientists have actually been fooling us, and to a degree is not even possible because most of the pathways that lead there do rely on BECCS, which we actually do not see in the world right now. On the other hand, it's also not that the IAM community that generated these results did want to be in any way prescriptive, right? So they were asked to show pathways that lead to different concentrations, and the lowest concentration pathway is only reachable now if we also take some carbon out. So it should not have come as such a surprise, but now there is a huge outcry over it and about it. But I would rather see it as an indication of that we're late. So the amount of these 3.3 gigatons of sea that we would need to extract by the end of the century is actually a very good proxy of how late we are. And if we are even later, then this number will be even higher. And we will have to think about something if we are not okay with what is basically in there right now. And BECCS is in there because the models knew how to do bioenergy and they knew how to do CCS. Then we have to actually look for other ways to decrease our emissions.
But I mean, just as a follow-up, but your last few slides actually show that you can actually reach the same with afforestation and reforestation. So to conclude from this graph that you need BECCS is a little bit misleading, isn't it?
Yes, so there are some pathways are in there that also use afforestation to get there. There are very little scenarios that rely on afforestation for reaching these low stabilization targets, and B, it has even stronger implications in terms of land requirements. So we're getting basically from one bad situation into the next bad situation. So even if we want to do it with afforestation, then we would have to worry about the limits to land and other resources as well, because you would also need to intensify agricultural production on areas that are now reserved for forest, which would again take up more water, fertilizers, and so on. So the fact that now we have a lot of BECCS in the scenarios is of course also historically explainable by how those models were born and raised. But I think just restricting them to afforestation is probably also not the ultimate solution.
And I'd also comment, it wouldn't be the first time that a technology was suggested first, and then the problems were looked at later.
I'm just, sorry.
Other questions?
I have a question about crop residues. In a lot of the world, crop residues are still burnt, and that's a major CO2 source. And some people have talked about combusting these residues in a low oxygen environment to create a more stable biochar to sequester carbon in the soil. Do you see that as part of a climate change solution? Would that have a significant impact?
Yeah, so actually biochar is also an option to generate negative emissions, but we have deliberately left it out here for the same reason that we left out the ocean fertilization, namely that we had the feeling that in the scientific community there was not a good consensus yet on the numbers, and also because there was a lot of concern about the permanence of the negative emissions, and but it is definitely a way of generating negative emissions that could have positive co-benefits and thereby be more easily implemented on the ground. So it's definitely something I think we should look into, along with actually also the option of soil carbon management. I think there are also a lot of low-hanging fruits that even have negative costs if you look at marginal abatement cost curves, and where you could where actually you don't even need a carbon price in order to implement it. And definitely, if you look at these numbers here, this 3.3 gigaton C, this is probably not what we're going to reach with biochar, but I think that seeing that there are different problems and different limits to each of those negative emission technologies, taking also the smaller ones on board to release the pressure on the limits and having a portfolio that still brings us close to those 3.3 tons of C is actually a very good thing. So I would say yes to your question.
Other questions?
I understand that you couldn't include everything right from the start, but I was thinking that including biodiversity and doing it very thoroughly might be vital, because that's one of the few things that's irreversible if you use it.
Yes.
That's it. And I was also wondering whether it might flip some of your outcomes, because afforestation might be actually the best for biodiversity. And you showed something in the last study.
Yeah. So this is something we're currently working on because we're also concerned about it. And actually there has been an article in Nature this year by colleagues from WCMC, and they have now for the first time a huge database with biodiversity maps for the whole world, and they were able to look also more closely at the drivers, and of course land use change is the driver of reducing species richness. And they use these results from this empirical analysis in order to see what would happen under these different RCPs. And what they found, of course, is that with unhindered climate change, the highest RCP, 8.5, we do see most of the species lost. And but interestingly, the next worst pathway was the RCP 2.6, because of a lot of land use change going on for climate change mitigation. And that is, of course, partially due to the cultivation of biomass going into forest areas and so on. So yes, taking these new results into account, and a lot of this, of course, came after the deadline for the AR5, will change the new set of scenarios. And I think having people like you raising these concerns, and then us trying to sort of pave the way for incorporating that into a new set of scenarios is basically what we should be doing now as a scientific community.
So I think we're out of time. So let's thank our speaker. I'm just going to hang around for a few minutes.
Yes,
if
I'll
anybody
also
can
have
get their question
the
answered.
papers here if you want.
Happy man.